welcome to the Brant History Happy Hour. So today I'm drinking what's called a Bluebell. So in here we got 1.5 ounces of vodka, 1/2 ounce of blue curacao, 2 dashes of lemon juice, you could also do lime juice as well, some ice, very important, and a lime garnish. And so the reason why we're drinking a Bluebell today is because we're going to kick off this series telling the history and story of the Bell Memorial and Alexander Graham Bell.
Cheers.
Cheers!
Alright, so how does this whole story start?
Okay, so let's go back to Scotland, like in Europe. So what happens is that that's where the Bell family is from. And so the weather's not great, and like you gotta think about, it's like the industrial period, right? So it's really thick air, really smoggy, you know, so the Bell family decides to come to Canada. So what happens is that the Bells actually had a family friend in Paris by the name of Thomas Henderson. And so Thomas Henderson, he's like, you guys gotta come here. They also lost 2 of their sons in Scotland because of ill health. And also little Alec, they called Alexander Graham Bell Alec. Alec was not doing too hot either in Scotland, like not good. So they thought, okay, we gotta get out of here. So Henderson says, come to Ontario. And so they decide, sure, let's go. They make their way across the ocean. They land first in Paris. So they stay with the Hendersons for a little bit because the property that they had at Toulouse Heights was being renovated. So it was under construction. So they sort of thought, okay, let's stick it out with Henderson for a little bit. Once that was done, they made their way to what is now the Bell homestead.
So Alexander Graham Bell's in Boston or in Brantford, or where is he?
He actually starts going to school in Boston, and then he makes his way for the summers here in Brantford. And so he was a smart cookie growing up, but yeah, essentially he would spend some time in Brantford, mingle around the town, and just enjoy that fresh country air when he'd come back here.
Kind of like what you're doing in the summer, coming back to Brantford.
Yeah, that's a classic summer student move. Apparently, he used to mingle with the town and country folk, but some people thought he was kind of weird. In fact, some rumors were circulating that he was doing some whacked experiments at the house. And one lady was like, a man stringing a wire through the country to talk through it has got to be one of the silliest pieces of tomfoolery ever was. He's clean daft. But that didn't stop Bell. He had this spot that overlooked the good old Grand River that he apparently called his dreaming place. He would lay out some rugs, a couple of pillows, and just take in the Brantford air. So, over the years, he would sit here, and one day he was like, yo, what if we had a speaking telegraph? And thus, the idea for the telephone was born. How lovely. Honestly, like if I laid down with a rug by the river, and especially with pillows, I get no work done. I just fall asleep.
So the telephone's invented in Brantford then, not in Boston.
Okay, well, here's the thing about the telephone debate. So you got the Americans saying, oh, well, Bell made the first telephone with American products, so obviously the telephone's American. But then you have a whole bunch of people in Brantford being like, no, hello, like literally hello. Like the telephone was invented and thought of in Brantford. So people later on would end up asking Bell, like, what's the shtick? Like, let's go to him, let's ask. So essentially he says, yeah, like even though I was sort of like a transnational guy, the idea is what really matters. So that idea was invented in Brantford. So there you have it. Like you sort of get that little stamp of Brantford on there, which is obviously super important.
Brantford's stamp of approval.
Always.
Okay, but that's about the creation of the telephone. What about the first actual telephone call?
Okay, yeah, so this is important because it also ties in Brantford as well. So, essentially, it's 1876. Bell comes up from Boston. He makes his way up, and he actually stations himself in Paris. So he's at 91 Grand River Street, and he's at Robert White's shoe and boot store. So he's hanging out there, and he's all ready. So then we actually have a lady by the name of Mrs. Brooks, who was also, she was known as Mrs. Tisdale, but she kind of grew up in the same area near Bell. Like, the families had property near each other, so she's kind of known to Bell, like, as Mrs. Brooks. Anyways, so she goes to the Dominion Telegraph Center at 150 Colbert Street. So she actually sings to our beloved inventor over the phone. So what she does is that, yeah, she gives Bell a phone call. So essentially it's like, instead of Bell calling up a lady, you got a lady calling up Bell.
She says ahoy hoy to him.
Sure, Mr. Burns. Jeez, but anyways, it ends up being an important moment for Victorian communication.
So hooray, the telephone's invented. That's the end of the story, right?
No, Nathan, I also still have more of my drink. Anyways, so what happens is that you got one of the greatest inventions of all time, right? So why not build a memorial for it? And that's exactly what another big important Brantfordian by the name of William F. Cockshutt thought. So our guy, he is the incoming president of the local board of trade. So he's already like motoring his way through the city. And so they're like, okay, like we need to get this memorial up because like the Americans were also like I mentioned earlier, right? They're like, we need to claim the telephone like yesterday. Yeah. So essentially they were like, well, we need to have the telephone because like we can't be the telephone city without the telephone, right? So anyways, they decide Cockshutt essentially leads this movement, you should say, to sort of help with the city memorial. Picture this. So Brantford is like the hot spot of industry at the time, right?
Third largest producer of gross domestic product in the country.
Yeah. We love GDP. Anyways, so what happens is that Cockshutt essentially is like, okay, like we need to claim this, right? So he writes the bell and he says, my friend, okay, listen, like we're thinking about doing this thing. Like we want to erect a memorial because you're arguably one of like the best inventors and like coolest people of all time. Surprise! And Bell's kind of like, okay, great, yeah, I love it. But also kind of like, why don't you wait until after I'm dead? Like, this is kind of weird. But anyways, do it. And they go ahead with it.
So we're still in the late 1800s now?
No. Okay, so now it's 1906, right? So this is gonna be a big deal, like a really big deal. Like only the best for Bell, right? So Cockshutt actually brings a bill to the provincial parliament, and it's sort of like an act to incorporate the Bell Memorial Association, which also helps bring in the Bell Homestead for heritage purposes, right? So it gets passed and they're off to the races. We got the committee and the Memorial Association was formed. It was comprised of some of the biggest and baddest Brantfordians. So, for example, we have the vice president being Lloyd Harris.
The Massey Harris Company.
Yep. E.L. Gould.
Gould, Shapley, and Muir.
G.H. Muirhead.
First Mayor of Brantford.
T.H. Preston.
Owner of the Expositor.
A.J. Wilkes.
Owner of Wilkes House.
C.H. Watrous.
Watrous Engine Works.
M.K. Halloran, who's the mayor from 1903 to 1904. George Kippax.
Landowner.
F.D. Revel.
Historian.
John Muir.
Military guy.
George Hatley.
Oh, another land baron.
Nathan Etherington.
Oh, I don't think I was there.
Just kidding. Anyways, so basically, if you imagine like any prominent Brantfordian at the time, they were probably associated with the memorial.
Okay, so the idea is there. How does it get done?
Ended up being kind of pricey, but that's okay, right? So they needed international cash, essentially. Like, they solicited donations. They got donations from England, from royalty. They got donations from America. So, for example, it's rumored that Thomas Edison might have actually donated to the memorial, which is kind of funny considering like the whole Brantford-Boston debate of the telephone. So anyways, we're just gonna sit on that. But they also got some local donations as well, and some government funding. But it's pretty impressive, like the amount. It ended up being around $65,000 to pay for this memorial, and it's pretty impressive considering that Brantford's population was like in the 20,000s at the time, right? So yeah, they did a pretty good job getting that dough.
Okay, so they have the money. Now what did they decide to build?
So this is the good stuff. So they needed a sculptor, right? And so they thought, okay, like, let's launch a competition, right? So what ends up happening is that this competition was international in scale. Like, they were getting people like submitting designs from Britain, from America, like Canada, all over, right? So what ends up happening is that they have like this subcommittee of some more artsy guys who are able to help judge and make the decision of how this thing's gonna look. So what ends up happening is that some of the designs were like really complex and like super allegorical, and like everyone's like, huh? Like looking at half of them. One of the sculptors, his name was Edward Pausch, American, right? So he ends up submitting a design. I think he almost comes in second, if I remember correctly. But he ended up like plagiarizing one of his past sculptures, and so we don't really want that, right? So it was none other than Walter Seymour Allward who wins, and he's from Toronto, so Canadian. Also, it is said that when an American competitor saw Allward's model being presented before his, the American said, "There's no use taking out my model, for nothing can win against that." So, Allward gets picked. Yay! So good, right? And man, he was so good. He had actually sculpted a whole bunch of other amazing pieces that are super important to Canada. Like in Toronto, he sculpted the South African War Memorial. I think it's on University Ave, actually. He sculpted the two beautiful standing figures outside the Supreme Court of Canada. And if we're thinking about Brantford, he also sculpted the War Memorial, so our cenotaph. That's Allward again. So we have two of his pieces hanging out here, and most importantly is the Vimy Memorial in France. So that was Allward's design. So he is super great, and so he basically just gets the job done.
Okay, so Allward wins with his amazing design.
Yeah, and so essentially, like, the committee was like, oh, well, we like how it's horizontal and it's not vertical, like so many other memorials that were going on at the time. So it was pretty unique. The design was stunning. He essentially wanted to show how man was discovering his power to transmit sound through space. And then there were three floating figures there, being knowledge, joy, and sorrow. You also have humanity sending and receiving messages. So it was a very beautiful, classic piece, and it screamed Brantford and Bell.
Okay, so how does he get the idea of representing humanity?
So essentially the model for humanity was by the name of Cyril William George Kinsella. So he was actually a British home child. So he came to Canada as a young boy, and so he was actually wounded at the Second Battle of Ypres. And so when he comes back and he's discharged, it's kind of fuzzy how like him and Allward first meet, but essentially like they get acquainted, and so that's how Allward designs the memorial and decides that, like, you know what, it would be interesting to have a wounded soldier be the model. So really layered and meaning, right? And so even though they didn't really know each other that right at the start, they got to know each other because it took Allward 2 months to sculpt poor Kinsella. So essentially what ends up happening is that the design is beautiful. It has so many different parts to it that are really, really like deep, right? Except for the fact that the committee wanted this all done by 1912 and a couple of problems arose.
Firstly, Allward was like, I want Tennessee marble. But the committee was like, no. We want Quebec's Stansted granite. Also, Allward had a very slow process and was busy working on other commissions because his work was a hot commodity, classic artist. Also, the first casting of the relief panel exploded at the Gorham Company in New York. And in the middle of building the memorial, of course, the Great War started, which impacted which products were being used for the construction of the memorial. So, a lot of problems accumulated. But when the memorial was finished, it was unveiled on October 24th, 1917. A pretty impressive feat considering the morale of the nation at the time.
Okay then, so what happens on the day of the unveiling?
What ends up happening is that it is in the middle of the Great War, and it's dark, it's stormy, the weather's not too great, except everyone comes up to the Bell Memorial. It's fantastic. So we have the Duke of Devonshire who comes down for the unveiling. So he actually is received at the Grand Trunk Station, and they make their way down Market Street, up Colburn, and then they head to the memorial, which is at the corner of West and Albion. And so you also had the Chief of Six Nations there, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, some really important like political figures came to this great unveiling. And Bell's there too! Except at the ripe age of 72. But that's okay, he made it. Nonetheless, he made it. He was a trooper. So what ends up happening is that everyone's hanging out there, and so Cockshutt decides to give his speech, and he welcomes everyone formally for the first time to the Telephone City. And so what happens is that it's 12 noon. They have some choirs, they have some bands, it's a great time, and then what happens is that His Majesty makes his way over to the curtain, pulls it, unveils it in all of its glory, and then BAM! A gunshot goes off. And then you have the church bells at Grace Church going off, and it's just this cacophony of grandness. And then what ends up happening is that it rains. So they have to make their way back to the Opera House, and for this elaborate reception, very, very fancy. And then they actually went to the Kirby House, the fanciest hotel in Brantford at the time, for this great dinner. And that's when Bell gives this great speech. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Bell spoke at the reception, and he concluded in his speech, "The moment I put my ear to the receiver, the most astounding noise made itself manifest. Thundering sounds like the explosion of artillery at a distance, and mixed up with these noises was a faint, faraway singer in Brantford."
Wow.
Doesn't it just give you chills?
Yeah.
So, the memorial, as we all know, it continued to be like a great public gathering space, and it's so essential to Brantford's civic identity, and it's so important to our public history. So, join us next week as we explore more of Brantford's history on Brant History Happy Hour. Cheers to that!